Hiya folks, it's Kikoskia here, and welcome back to Writing and Me. This video contains no gameplay or music whatsoever, allowing you to focus on whatever it is you're up to, whether it's writing, editing, listening to music, playing video games, working, or trying to get through the maze of the 15 dragons. Now listen carefully, because I can only give you these instructions once and you need to follow them exactly. Are you ready? Here we go. Turn around, go left, go up, through a tree, past the door, through the window. Go past the second window that you go by in that corridor. The third window you need to smash with a hammer. Once you've smashed it with a hammer, you then pick up the CD. You put the CD in the computer at the opposite side of the wall, and then you press XYP2173 exclamation mark. It will then ask for a password. You then put in 8884. When that happens, you'll start hearing some beeping. You then need to run down the corridor as fast as you can, because there's going to be an explosion that appears behind you that chases you. There'll be a pit trap beneath you. When you walk about 5 meters, you'll hear it rattling. You want to jump up and down multiple times so that you actually trigger that pit trap and fall down. You'll then be in a room with spikes that are closing in on you. You then want to jump back up through the hole that you fell down. Up to about halfway, you'll have the boots of jumping that you got previously in the dungeon. If you don't have those, oh my, you're in trouble, and you're probably going to die. But you probably have those. I'm sure you do. They were pretty obvious on a pedestal. Once you jump up, you will see some handhelds. You want to grab those and wait. Once the walls have closed up beneath you, they will then go back and they won't try and crush you again. You then want to drop down again and look around that room. You will find a tile that is different from all the others. It will be orange instead of blue. You want to press that tile 15 times, and then there will be a musical ditty. You need to remember that ditty, because you're going to need to whistle it later. A door will open, and go through the door. Slay the orc with the mace that you found right at the beginning of the dungeon. If you don't have that, well, much the same as if you didn't have the boots, but we're getting to that dangerous point. You will then find 5 more orcs. You need to slay all them with the mace, except for the final one. The final one cannot be taken out with the mace. You need to use the crossbow that you got over the bridge of lava. That crossbow only had 1 bolt. I hope you didn't use it on the werewolf, and instead talk to the werewolf, because the werewolf was actually quite approachable. Once you've took care of that orc, it's just a simple hop, skip, and jump over a bottomless ravine, and then you need to whistle that tune that you heard, and that will open the way to the prize, the treasure. The talisman of eternal riches. And then all you need to do is get out. But unfortunately, I can't tell you how to get out, because that is a puzzle all its own that I don't have a solution to. I only have half of the way to get that thing. If you want the other half, you're going to have to go to an alternate reality and find alternate reality me. I warn you though, he's not going to be very appreciative that you're pestering him. With that aside, it's time to talk about today's topic, and it is a very important one. Pacing. I've mentioned it offhand now and again in the other topics, and whether I've described it as pacing or the flow, it is all the same thing. Pacing is the rate at which the story progresses, the rate at which the plot occurs and events happen. But why is that so important? Because a story with poor pacing is very difficult to follow. But what is poor pacing? What is good pacing? The answers to that all come from what's typically done to maintain pacing. And for this, I'm going to give you an example. The Lord of the Rings trilogy. The Lord of the Rings trilogy, from the time that Frodo and Sam leave Hobbiton to go and get rid of the ring, to destroying the ring, takes about a year. But what many people don't remember is that the period between Gandalf leaving after Bilbo's party and then coming back to Frodo with the bad news about the ring is 17 years. It's something that's glossed over in the film. In the animated film, it is mentioned offhand, and there's a series of transitions that shows the various seasons going by super quickly and then returning to the action. When I tell people this, they go, 17 years? Really? What happened in those 17 years? The answer is, nothing significant for the story. Significant events happened, of course, but they weren't focused on the 2 characters at that point who were important, Gandalf and Frodo. Gandalf is busy going around Middle-earth looking for information concerning the ring that Bilbo had. And Frodo is just living his life in peace. He doesn't know about the One Ring. He doesn't know about the threat to Middle-earth. He is just living in Hobbiton, in Bag End, as he always does. By the time the actual adventure starts, I think Frodo's in his 50s. That is an example of pacing. For another example of this, I pose you a question. When was the last time you read in a story that a character went to the toilet? It probably was a long time ago, because most of the time you don't hear about it. Why? Because it's not important to the narrative. It is presumed that characters do mundane things as other events are going on. Even though they may be buccaneering space pirates trying to fly to the center of the universe, they still need toilet breaks, they still need to eat, they'll have time to sleep, and all of these things are usually not mentioned unless something important happens during one of those things. And important, of course, depends entirely on the narrative. It doesn't have to always be, and then space aliens attack. Sometimes it's a conversation that occurs at the dinner table, or something that a character realizes while they're washing their hands after they've been to the toilet. These are events of significance, and they deserve attention. Everything else gets 2 weeks past as they continue to fly through the cosmos. That is sufficient for the reader to bring up an image in their mind of the humdrum things that are going on. You could even put things that are important in those 2 weeks, but would be a pain to describe, like someone meticulously researching a book for a vital piece of information. You can have 2 weeks go by, and then they get that eureka moment when they find what they want, and they go, aha! This! That word there, that is what I need. It is part of the password to open up the quantum door. Then they put the book away, and that is when the time ninjas attack. And you immediately have action. Don't always need to go straight to action. Not all stories need action all the time, but I'm going to be going on to that in a little bit. The pacing of the story is maintained by not having a third of this story be devoted to thumbing through an ancient tome trying to find this word. Unless your story is about thumbing through an ancient tome trying to find a word, in which case, carry on. By condensing that 2 weeks into something a lot smaller, you keep the story going. You keep it moving towards that end goal that you've had in mind since you planned everything out. You make sure that the pace doesn't slow down needlessly. That leads, however, to a very interesting question, and that is, does the pacing have to remain constant? And the answer to that is no. I've had some people ask me to talk about this because of the fact that they were reading a story and then suddenly it skipped 2 months and they felt disconnected from it. They didn't think that it was right for the story to do that. The reason why they skipped those 2 months we've already gone over, because nothing really significant to the story happened. They were able to condense down those 2 months into a paragraph, maybe even half a paragraph. That story, however, won't skip 2 months every single chapter. It won't always skip the same amount of time, and events are focused upon not because they take place over a specific period, but because they are significant. You can have a story that has the first 5 or 6 chapters take place over a couple of days, but if there is an entire year where nothing significant happens, you can skip over that year with a small amount of text and then carry on the story, making sure that the story keeps going. You could also have the opposite, where you're skipping huge amounts of time. You have an event here, character goes back into cryostasis. 5 years later, another event here, character goes back into cryostasis. Suddenly, cryostasis error. Can't go back into cryo. You then have a focus on the next week, as the characters desperately try and get the cryo system working again, because there are people that need to be under cryo, otherwise the medical conditions that they're being rushed to a hospital far on the other side of the galaxy to be treated for are getting worse. So you have this race to fix this, while the few doctors that are on board are frantically trying to prevent patients from deteriorating. Both of these are perfectly valid, and you need to keep a firm eye on the pacing of your story to make sure that there aren't long parts where the pacing is thrown completely out of sync. And you need to keep an eye on your pacing. Make sure that ultimately the story does flow to its conclusion at a reasonable pace. That doesn't have to be a constant pace, though. Saying all this, though, there is nothing wrong with having a story that has a consistent pace. There is nothing wrong with the story having one chapter dedicated to one day. If your story takes place over 3 weeks, 21 chapters, one day per chapter, that's absolutely fine. That kind of story would focus more on the minutiae of things that are going on. You would talk about them eating meals, watching shows, and things like that, all dependent on the plot, of course. Such pacing is absolutely fine as long as you maintain it. I'd actually say that maintaining a regular pace all the way through the story is actually harder than skipping different amounts of time here and there, because you need to be very mindful of how much time passes in each little segment and make sure that they're roughly equal. This can be very tricky when you have lots of dialogue, because dialogue actually takes place over a very short period of time. You could devote 2 or 3 pages to a dialogue that takes place over 10 minutes. That same amount of space could be used to describe many hours of other events, and you need to make sure that there is a balance of space in your story so that the events of one day do not hugely overshadow the events of other days. In a story with a regular pacing, this could happen quite easily. You could have one chapter devoted to an entire hour if this hour is exceptionally dramatic and needs the attention. But if you're really going for that, well, one chapter, one day, you then need to start picking and choosing what things you are not talking about. And then you're right back to what I was saying earlier about pacing. You are deciding to omit things that aren't important to make sure that the story keeps moving forward. As for what events you should be clipping out of your story to maintain the pacing, that entirely depends on what the story is about. And it's quite likely that on your first run-through of the story, you are going to leave a lot of things in that will disrupt the pacing, that will be removed in your first edit. Because as you are writing a story, you are less able to glean how this pacing is going, because you are focused on the bit that you're writing now, you're thinking about the little bit further ahead, you're thinking about the very end, and you also have the bit that you've just written in mind. You don't have the entire picture. You'll only have that once you've finished it, and once it is done, and you start back from the beginning, you can then keep track of the pacing. You can go, okay, chapter 1 is okay, chapter 2 is a little bit slow, but that makes sense because there's this huge thing that happens. Chapter 3, however, is mostly wasteful, and I can get rid of this, I can get rid of that, get rid of this. This thing here is completely useless, and then you condense it all down, and all of that helps to improve the pacing. As you go through the chapters, you will get a better grip on what the pacing is going to be, and then you can look far further ahead and see events that you can preemptively condense down, or remove, or sometimes expand upon. You may look at an event and decide that it actually needs more attention put towards it, especially considering that you've removed lots of other things beforehand. And so, you add stuff so that this event doesn't go by too fast, thus tripping up the pacing. What you're going to need to add and what you're going to need to remove, again, depends entirely on your story. It depends on what kind of thing it is. An action story will have far more intense moments of things going on in a short period, whereas a slice of life story, there will be longer gaps and more generalized statements as to weeks going by without too much incident, because you're just picking the various slices and events that are important. The two stories have different requirements, thus they need to have different pacing. This is all so that you can keep the reader's attention. Correct pacing does wonders for having them flow from chapter to chapter. There's that word flow again, whereas incorrect pacing will quite often stop the story dead in its tracks and make the reader scratch their head in confusion. Really bad pacing can absolutely kill a story and make them never finish it. But if you're diligent with your editing, you'll likely weed out most of those parts as you're going through. Pacing is one of those things that you can actually benefit from having somebody else that you know read through it and get their opinion on it. They can probably see things with the pacing that you can't, because you're so absorbed in the narrative and involved in its creation. They, as an external viewpoint, will look at things in a different light, and there's a good chance that they will find an opportunity for you to improve the pacing in a couple of instances. Whether you take them up on that is entirely your call. Sometimes what is perceived as incorrect pacing has a very important reason behind it, something that they probably won't be able to see because you know a lot more about the story. It could even be for something in a future story. And so, ultimately, pacing is very important indeed. It is there to make sure that people keep reading from chapter to chapter, and maintaining pacing is a constant battle between picking events that are important and summarising the things that aren't. And it doesn't have to remain constant unless you want it to. Either way, it is a tricky thing to juggle, along with all the other things that you're juggling. All the things that I've mentioned, characters, world building, the plot, and dialogue, romance, villains, they're all there. You're juggling every single one of them. Some of the things are on fire, some of them are chainsaws, and you think that one slip up will send everything tumbling to the ground in a disastrous pile of failure. But don't think that. Because everyone makes mistakes, everyone has things go wrong, that is just a part of being human. Your story, even if that happens, is not ruined. You can always continue working on it. You can always find what's wrong and make it better. Don't be discouraged if your pacing is all over the place. You can fix it. I have faith that you can fix it. And you can make the story even better than what it already is. It'll take time, a lot of effort, and even more effort, but you can do it. I believe in you. And so, that is a brief conversation about the importance of pacing in a story. And when we come back, folks, we'll talk about something else equally as important. Another thing to deal with in your never-ending juggling act that is writing. And so, I'll catch you next time, folks, and I'll see you then. Later.